Welcome to this RSAA panel discussion. In October 2017, Xi Jinping said, "United Front work is an important magic weapon for the victory of the party's cause." Now, I suspect that Xi Jinping does not believe in magic any more than most people do, but this quotation does convey very well the notion that things that may seem impossible can be achieved with the right tools and the right approach. So today I'm pleased to welcome Gerry Groot, Steve Tsang, Martin Purbrick, and we hope also June Teufel Dreyer, but we're having some communication problems with Florida at the moment. Between them, they are going to unpick the concept of United Front work and tell us why it matters in understanding contemporary China. I will leave more complete introductions to Martin, who will be moderating today's discussion, but I think it just is worth noting as we start that the ways in which countries and their leaders describe themselves and their activities tells us a lot about them, even if we do not share their perspective or necessarily take it seriously. Every state has its own self-image, and ignoring these has its risks. Until Russia invaded Ukraine, not many people thought that the idea of Ruski Mir, the Russian nation, had much significance in realpolitik, but it turns out to have had more significance than we thought. In the same vein, United Front work is a concept that deserves to be better understood and to be given greater credence in the way we view the operation of the modern Chinese state and Xi Jinping's Communist Party. With that, I will hand over to Martin to get the discussion going. The panelists will take questions at the end, so if you have questions to ask, please use the Q&A button on your screens, not the chat channel, please. And Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'll give a very brief introduction, and first, if I could please introduce the two panelists. So, as you said, the discussion today is the CCP's United Front magic weapon or paper tiger. Perhaps just to go backwards to where that particular quote came from, and it was, I think, attributed to Xi Jinping in October 2017, when he said, "United Front work is an important magic weapon for the victory of the party's cause." It's been called a magic weapon for many decades, I think originally by Mao Zedong. So the United Front approach of the Chinese Communist Party, and I think perhaps we distinguish the Chinese Communist Party from Chinese state, although it's somewhat the same, I would suggest is quite misunderstood, or in many cases not at all understood in Western countries, as somehow a part of how the CCP perpetually governs a one-party state. And I think it's increasingly important that we do understand it now with the far greater international influence of China, the People's Republic of China. So I'll leave the background of how United Front came to exist to Gerry and Steve shortly, but if I could just give another introduction to them, which is on the Eventbrite text, but I think worth stating who they are again. Gerry is senior lecturer in Chinese studies at the University of Adelaide. Obviously, he's worked for many years with a strong interest in Chinese politics and political history, very well known for his quite extensive work on CCP United Front, particularly with China's so-called democratic political parties, which I'm sure Gerry will expand on shortly. He's written a great many papers on United Front, which I'd recommend reading for those of you, especially in the UK, who don't yet understand enough about United Front, including how United Front has changed during the tenure of President Xi Jinping, which is obviously very important. We next have Steve Tsang, professor at SOAS, director of the China Institute at that university. His research interests focus on 20th century Chinese history and the growing influence of the country politically and economically. He's also written extensively, obviously, about the CCP influence in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and around the world, and is currently working on a book on the political thought of Xi Jinping, which we will be recommending to members of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, Steve, don't worry. So Gerry, perhaps if we could start off with you. I think it would be nice to set the scene. Could you tell us what United Front is, how it developed historically through the period of Mao Zedong, to now become an integral part of CCP strategy? And how do you see the international aspects of United Front and how they've developed in recent years, especially?
Quickly speaking, I'll try to give some sort of justice to what deserves an encyclopedia's worth of work, which is the history of Chinese United Front work, an overview in about 10 minutes. So I'll give a very brief summary of what it is, the concept and the means, a very brief history, United Front work in the reform era to sort of bring it up to the present. And then even though there's a very important distinction between what's happened since Xi Jinping came to power because of his emphasis on it, it's too easy to overstate the degree of change. So I just want to make that point. And then finally, who's doing it, which is also very it's a very rough overview, but let's go. Okay, so basically, United Front, which says it all in the title, maximizes alliance against the principal enemy and uses any and all means to weaken, delegitimize, and defeat the enemy. Because Mao, you might remember, hopefully our audience has some knowledge, some background knowledge of some of this at least. Who are our enemies? Who are our friends? This is a question of first importance, right? So this is the fundamental issue which determines what the alliances are targeted against and who can be an ally and the degree to which concessions can be made. So the principal as the principal contradictions change, so too do the targets, the allies, and the means. And the initial revolutionary goal for the Communist Party was to win the majority of classes and the majority of the people to the party's aims, or at least in some way to be seen to symbolically do so. And that included to have people at least not oppose them. And the reason was so that the party could claim revolutionary legitimacy. That was the overall long-term goal. But there are lots of practical things in the meantime, like stopping the Kuomintang from attacking them. Okay. Unstated is that reducing enemies by persuading some to become neutral is just as important as persuading some to become friends in what is a zero-sum game. This is the bit that often gets forgotten, and I keep on harping on it. So there's a key role for symbolically important individuals and thought leaders and people with strong ideological influences and the people that they've got connections, especially in a Chinese social context. And today, the person who decides what the party's principal contradiction is Xi Jinping. And we know that what he wants most is to have the world safe for the CCP. So how do we do this? What are the means? The means are very simple in essence, but not necessarily in practice. To make concessions to the material interests of those needed as allies against the principal enemies. That's pretty instrumentalist, and it's often dressed up more importantly in terms of powerful appeals to some moral or political or other principle. So nationalism, patriotism, those sorts of things. You know, building a strong China, preventing China from being defeated by Japan, you know, those sorts of things. Building socialism, could be anything. The building of close personal links and depths of personal obligation. So you can see that those are more important contextually in a Chinese context than abroad, but, you know, they're important with non-Chinese people as well. Public criticism and ideological indoctrination, up to and including coercion, to keep allies in line and to persuade and to stop them from straying, and that's That's the principle of unity and struggle. So it's not always fun being an ally, because sometimes you get criticized by the party on one side and the other people that you're criticizing on the other, as some of the people on my right would testify if they were alive today. And some of you who are aware of this might notice that I've got a mix of military figures and academics. And down the bottom, we've got Song Ching Ling, who deserves an encyclopedia on her own, I'm sure. So a very brief history of United Front work starts in the 1920s, when the Communist International under Hendrik Schneefliet implemented a bloc within strategy, forcing the Chinese Communist Party to ally with the nationalists and join the Nationalist Party and use their skills in order to organize the party along proper Leninist lines and to make it stronger. And the idea was that they would eventually drive it to the left, although it was in some respects it was fairly left in the 20s anyway, but nevertheless, and eventually take it over. But with the death of Sun Yat-sen and the takeover of the Kuomintang by Jiang Jieshi, that didn't happen, and instead he turned on the Communist Party, and there was a terrible massacre in 1927, and the communists were forced to flee to the countryside. The second round was also forced on the party, and that was by Stalin directly, when he wanted the nationalists and the communists to come together in order to resist the Japanese invasion of China, because he wanted to protect that side of the Soviet Union from potential invasion by the Japanese. And in the beginning, that was a difficult pill for the Communist Party to swallow, but they gradually came round. And as they became more comfortable with using, that's not right. As they became more comfortable with using United Front work, it over the years became assimilated as a key part of Communist Party practice. And although one of the reasons for its success was, although Mao is given lots of credit, Zhou Enlai and many other, Liu Shaoqi and lots of other really capable communist leaders did it consistently and thoroughly and very, very effectively. It was a whole of party effort. And if you look at the way that the communists survived in the countryside and the way that the United Front worked there, the importance of United Front work with minor business people and the business people in the cities undermines the notion that the revolution was based on just the peasants revolting, right? And the peasants going with the Communist Party, because without the urban support that the communists were getting via United Front work, that wouldn't have been enough anyway, even if that element of peasant nationalism was true. And another important thing to know is that as soon as the Communist Party knew about Pearl Harbor, they refocused all their work on the long-term United Front strategy of undermining the nationalists, because they knew that the nationalists were going to be the principal contradiction, because they knew that Japan was going to lose from that moment on. Urban United Front work with the minor parties, with key personages, with other military figures like Long Yun and the young marshal, people like that. But in the cities in particular, using democratic spaces left by the Kuomintang allowed pressure on the Kuomintang to prevent it annihilating the Communist Party. So the use of any little bit of democracy to attack the CCP was useful. once the Communist Party came to power, we needed to have the transition to socialism. And the communists had promised under New Democracy, which you've got here, a young Mao with, you know, is the manifesto of New Democracy, in which there was supposed to be the long-term coexistence of different forms of ownership and different classes. There was supposed to be 很长时间, right? A very long time, but it turned out only to be 7 years. Not even that, really. So that tells you something about the conditional nature of promises in a United Front context. Promises hold only as long as they are necessary. United Front work, in this period, United Front work was used to reach overseas Chinese and call them home and help build a new China, to stimulate private businesses to increase production and not flee abroad, to begin to use key figures in important groups to model how to think and behave in the new society, and it included reaching out to ethnic minorities and religious believers. So those were important parts of the transition to socialism, and it expanded, it had expanded in that context to a broader domestic agenda than it had under the wartime footing. But the 100 Flowers campaign of 56, strongly encouraged by the United Front Work Department and its head Li Wei-hun, which was supposed to help overcome some of the problems in the Communist Party, also brought out criticisms of Mao, and Mao didn't like that. And as a result, he launched the anti-rightist campaign. And as a result, many of the allies were attacked as bourgeois elements and counter-revolutionaries, and it marked the beginning of the end of United Front work. So by the end of the anti-rightist campaign in 59 or so, lots of urban United Front work was falling apart. And the Cultural Revolution was the final nail in the coffin. But if we're going to sum it up, I would say that United Front work had helped the Communist Party to manage a relatively smooth transition to socialism, at least in urban areas. I'm not talking about what happened in the countryside with the land reform program, in which hundreds of thousands of people were killed. In the reform era, that is after Mao died, and United Front work was one of the first things, the first policies to be sort of reinstituted. There was a need to rebuild stronger ties and trust to help get back to where they were in 56 and get past it. So they needed to rebuild ties with overseas Chinese to get access to investment, to technology, to utilize their connections and political influence, and in part because they were already conscious of competing with Taiwan for influence for hearts and minds amongst overseas Chinese. So that's something to bear in mind. They had to worry about those overseas Chinese who had returned in the 50s from 1949 onwards. Many of those had suffered, and they had to be somehow rehabilitated and persuaded not to tell everybody else how terrible it was, but instead to encourage overseas Chinese to come back and invest in China. They wanted to make good with religious believers who had been seriously harmed by the Cultural Revolution. They needed to make good with intellectuals and capitalists, because if you wanted to modernize society, you needed to have a revalidation of knowledge, of science, of technology. And amongst the ways that they did that was to use these minor parties and groups as ways of finding out about these key constituencies and influencing them. And one of the first things that these groups did was to help in the process of rehabilitating many of those people who'd been criticized as rightists. To get more insight and influence in Taiwan, the status of former Kuomintang military and administrative officials was rehabilitated. and they were given more freedom of movement, etc. One thing which was often missed, but was actually probably taken from the example in Taiwan, was that former capitalists who had lost all their businesses by 56, 57, the ones who were still owed money from their nationalization were paid out, and they were allowed to use that money to invest in new businesses and use that to link up with overseas Chinese. And one of the big things to come out of that was the rise of CITIC, this investment corporation, the Chinese investment corporations. So they originated as a united front initiative, and are still heavily involved in it, I'm sure.
Just a quick reminder on time, Gerry. We're pressing on. If you could on as quickly as you could, so we have time.
Okay, so these days we've got all these new interest groups. The United Front workers had to expand in order to get through that. We've got chambers of commerce and business associations. The main Federation of Industry and Commerce is now an incredibly rich and powerful body, and United Front work has been expanding dramatically. But one of the things which didn't happen, which was expected, was that economic success didn't make religious believers and ethnic minorities more Han-like or more Chinese-like. So that was a problem. So then, with the rise of Xi Jinping, some of these debates which had been going on in the background became a bit of an issue. And we've had a more emphasis on sinification of religion, a reversion to assimilation rather than allowing pluralization of ethnic identity, and a far greater worry about profusion of overseas Chinese. And therefore, overseas Chinese workers become more important because they want to know who they are, what they're doing, what they're thinking, and make sure that Taiwan doesn't win their hearts and minds. So we've got lots of people doing it. We've got Xi Jinping and his small leading group, the International Liaison Department. Every member of the CCP has a responsibility for it. The Army has it, the Air Force, businesses which are big enough have it. And anybody can be called on to do such work. So everybody's doing it. It can be a magic weapon, but not everywhere all the time. In Hong Kong, it was very helpful in the lead up to the transition in 1997, but because it concentrated on the big end of town and not the bottom end, they had no idea what many people were thinking, and they were caught unawares. And the same on Taiwan. So in Taiwan, the United Front work, ironically, is reliant on an aging and out of touch Kuomintang, which has become very pro-China in many instances, and on triad criminals. So not so successful. In that context, there's been a huge investment, but not necessarily a huge return. Thank you.
Gerry, that's a very nice visual introduction and a very detailed one and a very quick historical run through. I think your pictures there at the end are fascinating. I think the one in the middle was quite an infamous leader of one of the major secret societies in Taiwan, the Four Cs. I can't remember which one, but an extraordinary personality. But as you say, it says something about the nature of United Front, and they have to rely on people like that. And perhaps we can come back a bit later to more about Hong Kong as well. It's another interesting example of the success and failure of United Front in some ways. So could I skip on? And June, I do apologize. I didn't introduce you earlier as you weren't on there, but perhaps if I could just, for the audience benefit, remind them who you are. Professor June Teufel Dreyer, Senior Fellow at the Asia Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and Professor of Political Science at the University of Miami. A former Far East Specialist at the Library of Congress, Asia Policy Advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations, and Commissioner of the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission. And in particular, I do like June's publication in 2018, A Weapon Without War, China's United Front Strategy, which is a very nice explanation of United Front and what it means. June, we're crossing time zones. We've come from Australia across to the US. So from your perspective in Miami, could you tell us how you see United Front is perceived internationally, how it's a tool of PRC foreign policy, and if you could, anything about United Front's activities in the US? Your own overview would be fascinating, please. You're on mute.
Mute, yes. Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Yes, the view of the United Front internationally. And first, if I may, I will give you my own view. And that is that I am struck by how well coordinated the whole United Front concept is, from top to bottom, country to country. And it really is an international organization. So it operates in Portugal, where leaflets were torn out of a booklet because by the United Front lady, because it was taken out by the Zhang Jinghua Foundation, which is Taiwan. But Zhang Jinghua himself, to his dying day, said he hoped for unification with China, unification under the Kuomintang, of course. But so things like that. And then banning basketball games, the showing of basketball games in China, because they a person on a team said that he had sympathy for what was going on in Hong Kong. And getting Taiwan removed from airline schedules and hotels, unless it was regarded as Taipei, China, instead of Taipei, Taiwan. So they've been very successful in many ways. And more and more, what I see is the heavy-handed tactics causing a backlash. It's as if Xi Jinping, by his very aggressive tactics, have convinced the international community that when he says the community of common destiny, what he means is a project of the sinicization of the international system. So if I could switch to something I actually know better, and that is the situation in the United States. I think initially China was working on the top level of government, perhaps under the misimpression that the United States was more influenced by what goes on at the top than what goes on at the bottom, which would be understandable in the Chinese context, because what happens at the top does go down better at the bottom. And they were helped in this by actually a former colleague at the Library of Congress, who later became a national intelligence officer, who said that since Taiwan was so good at lobbying, he thought it only proper to instruct the Chinese communists on how better to lobby Congress. And so they made some successes there, some ways in which fairness is not really fair in the end result, but that's the way he felt. And then as moods in Washington hardened, and this definitely predates the Trump administration, the Chinese began to give more emphasis on working toward the lower levels. And in this, they were very successful. There is a wonderful study on this available free on the web called All Over the Map. And if you just type that into Google, it will come out. The map they have in mind is the United States. And two Chinese think tanks working in tandem have classified each American state into favorable to China, neutral toward China, and hostile to China. In case anyone's wondering, my own state is regarded as hostile. And surprising to me, California, which from my work on the commission, I would have easily classified as very pro-China, is in the neutral state phase. And it's the Plains states that are regarded as very pro-China. And of course, when you take half a second to think about it, it's because they sell a lot of their agricultural products to China. On the other hand, a state which is very wary of China is Texas, which also has a lot of soybeans and wheat and other things, and also high-tech items to sell. And the Chinese government, under the guise of the United Front, organized a US governors conference held every year in a different state. And the first one was actually attended by Xi Jinping. This is right before the coronavirus. And he hasn't been anywhere since that I can figure out. And welcomed them all. And to use a phrase from my native Brooklyn, schmoozed them, wooed them with promises of lucrative development. And so Xi Jinping has not showed up at any of the others, but prominent members of the United Front have. And they've tried all kinds of other tactics, clandestinely supporting the campaigns of friendly candidates through donations from Chinese American groups, members of whom are Chinese American business people who get lucrative contracts from the Chinese government. And they haven't eschewed the honey trap either, as Representative Eric Swalwell is reputed to have found out. So they're working on all levels. And even in my state, which is regarded as hostile, I had the opportunity to attend a conference 3 years ago with the Consul General from Houston. Miami does not have a Consul General from the PRC. And the streets of Coral Gables are adorned with, the main drag of Coral Gables is adorned with flags. And one of those flags is the flag of the Republic of China on Taiwan. So they are not welcome here. And I want to make an important point here, because if had you attended this meeting, you would have been interested at the level of enthusiasm for Chinese investment under whatever circumstances. The Consul General, who was formerly an ambassador before being posted to Houston, which I think tells you something about the importance that the Chinese hold for Texas, largely, I think, because of the aerospace industry. But anyhow, he is, as you would expect, a consummate speaker. He's really good. And it was like, for me, it was like watching the trainer with dog treats for a bunch of eager canines. And he would say, we can help you with high-speed rail. And somebody would say, yes. And then somebody would say, what we really need is short-speed rail, local trains. And he would say, absolutely, we can help. And it was like watching the dogs leap for the bone. Now, I don't know what came of that, but it was certainly an example of successful tactics for the United Front. Dangle money and friendship and the community of common destiny, and they will come. And Taiwan. Gerry, I would have to disagree with you very slightly here, in that I think the Chinese Communist United Front tactics, although they continue to operate, have basically given up on the Kuomintang. And they are concentrating on other parties. They haven't totally abandoned the Kuomintang, but they have switched tactics to support several other parties. One of them is the New Party, founded in 1993. Another one is the CUPP, the China Unification Promotion Party. And this is the one that Martin mentioned a minute ago. It was headed by the head of the Bamboo Union, the Four Cs. And you would wonder why they would want to get involved with such an unsavory character. And the word that was put out is he had reformed. So apparently the kind of Christian type of forgiveness was extended to him. And then there's another one called the Home Party. And this is a very interesting party founded in 2017. And it was aimed at farmers and fishermen. And what it aims to do is discredit the Democratic political parties, Democratic Progressive Parties, DPPs, agricultural policies. And you can see the United Front at work in United States agricultural areas as well. I mentioned that those were states that were regarded as favorable. For example, in Donald Trump wanted a trade war against China, and this involved putting tariffs on Chinese goods, and the Chinese responded with tariffs on American soybeans and so on. And at that point, you began to see a lot of Chinese United Front advertising in newspapers like the Des Moines Register about how, now, not mentioning that it was funded by China, but that it was Trump's agricultural policies would be a disaster. And the interesting thing about this is that normally these states are very pro-Republican. They're regarded as red states. And you see what they're trying to do, because the red states are crucial in tipping the election from the Republicans to the Democrats, who are regarded as far more friendly. And Martin, I see you want to bring in Steve now. Like most academics, I think in 90-minute segments, and I apologize for going over time.
So June, this session could be a lot longer. There's a lot more to say, and it's quite crowded. But I'm glad you referenced Taiwan and Gerry's excellent picture, which I think is the white wolf. And I guess the word to describe people like him and those others who United Front organizations used is obviously patriotic, which is an important word in Hong Kong as well these days. You have to be patriotic to love China. And triads and secret societies have a history of being patriotic.
Yes, they do.
When they need to.
When they're not overthrowing dynasties.
Exactly. Yeah. So Steve, really, we'll come back to you now for British summertime. We've cut across the world's time zones. From your perspective here in the UK, in London, could you talk about United Front as a magic weapon, the methodologies they employ, the approaches they take? How do you see it from this part of the world, please?
Thank you, Martin. I will keep it to 10 minutes, and I have a stopwatch, and I will be actually using it to do so. Now, when we talk about the United Front, it is a really wonderful way of understanding how the Chinese government help us to understand China. It is very much designed to confuse and mislead, because when the term United Front is being referred to, it means many different things. And it means different things in different times, in different contexts, and there's absolutely no intention on the part of the Chinese government to help us understand it. If we fail to understand it, so much the better, because that isn't in some ways part of what the United Front is about. Most of the time, when we talk about the United Front, we are talking about the work of the United Front Work Department, the kind of engagement and infiltration into the overseas Chinese communities, or indeed to engage with the non-overseas Chinese communities to get them to support the Chinese government. That certainly is important. But in fact, the bulk of the work of the United Front Works Department focus on work domestically within Chinese boundaries, rather than focus on the international work. Where the United Front becomes a magic weapon is when the United Front is being used as a methodology. And that is the bit that Gerry very helpfully illustrated, that the United Front is for the United Front Works Department, the United Front is for the military, and etc., until he says the United Front is for every party member and indeed for everybody to practice. Now, what is it about? As a magic weapon, as a methodology, the United Front is about distinguishing friends and enemies and making sure that China ends up with all friends and no enemies. How does it work? Imagine a room, let's use the backdrop that Martin has. In a room like what Martin has, in one end of it sits China, at the other end of that table sits the principal enemy or principal contradiction of China, whatever that happens to be. In between, you have many seats, some of them closest to China, some of them closest to the principal contradiction. And you also have seats right in the middle. So you have there those who are closer to China as natural friends of China, and those closest to the principal contradiction, the natural friends of the principal contradiction. And then you have the middle, wavering middle. The objective about the United Front is that in this room, in this world, or in this political context, whatever that happens to be, you identify and focus entirely on your principal contradiction. You accept that amongst the natural friends of your principal contradiction, it's a bit rather difficult to win them over at this stage yet. And those who are sitting close to you are your friends anyway, so you engage with them, but basically just keep them sweet. It's in the intermediate zone, the wavering middle, that you focus your work. And by devoting your work in the intermediate zone, you will be able to either win over a large number of them or neutralize those who are unable to be won over, but at least you could neutralize them. So you basically unite the greatest number of people or players in that context and focus your attention and your resources and the new friendship you have acquired to destroy your principal contradiction. Once you have successfully destroyed your principal contradiction, you move on. What do? You elevate from the secondary contradictions, the original natural friends of your principal contradiction, and pick one out and elevate it to become your principal contradiction. And you repeat that process until in this room, you have no more contradiction left. They are all either friends or having been neutralized. That's what the United Front is about. Now, if and when that is being practiced, that's the magic weapon. That's what Chairman Mao intended the United Front to do in the course of the so-called Revolutionary War until the Communist Party came to power. And it worked like almost like a charm, at least mostly like a charm for him. And that's why it has been seen in those terms. Does it always work? Well, theory is beautiful. Practice is always messy. And that applies to the United Front too. When we actually see the United Front being put at work, we see a lot of local variations because the people who are in charge of implementing, practicing the United Front don't always have that strong discipline and stick to the way how the United Front is meant to work. And the United Front works better when China feels more modest, because it is about winning friends and about neutralizing enemies. And a more modest, engaging way is an easier way to win friends. So in the period, for example, of the Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao era, when China was focusing on what Hu Jintao would call a peaceful rise approach. United Front actually worked better for China, even though people like Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin were less focused on the importance and the beauty of the United Front than Xi Jinping. I mean, Xi Jinping talks more about the United Front. He sees as more important than, in fact, Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin would have talked about. But a difference is that Xi Jinping's approach is fundamentally one of China has now risen. China now not really bothers to politely request, but simply require the rest of the world to pay it due respect. I mean, that fundamentally contradicts how the United Front is supposed to work. When the government in Beijing unleashed wolf warrior diplomats, which really only happened in the last couple of years under Xi Jinping, the United Front magic wears off more. Now, very sort of practically, I think this is what Martin perhaps had intended me to mention, is about how it actually works in the UK. I think both the overseas Chinese communities are being targeted and the non-Chinese communities are also being targeted, but in slightly different kinds of ways. And a lot of the engagement with the overseas Chinese communities is built on that appeals to patriotism, the being proud of the achievements of China, and use that to engage with them and make them feel that if you don't support Mother China, you really are not a good patriot. And of course, if you do, and you come out very openly doing so, as some Chinese students have done when there were Tibetans or Hong Kong students protesting about other things, then they get a negative reactions. And the United Front very beautifully comes in and say, well, you know, you think that you are a Chinese British? Well, they don't really embrace you as a Brit, do they? Mother China comes and looks after you. So know what is good for you. That's one way of engaging it. For the non-Chinese communities, it is creating the concept of friends of China, and even better, old friends of China. When you are being described in those terms, you know you are important targets of the United Front work. And when you are an old friend of China, you know you are very highly valued because you are doing a lot of what they would like you to do. And that applies across the different sectors and professions. They will apply the same magic on you if they can. Luckily, in the application of the United Front, like going to war, it never survives contact. I'll stop here and hand it back to you, Martin. I think just about
very much, Steve. I think with all three of you, we've rounded off a lot here. An old friend of China, I think Kissinger is always referred to as an old friend of China, isn't he? Just saying, but I think that it's obviously a problematic term. I think I'd like to go back to Gerry with a couple of the questions, and Gerry, perhaps I could package them together if you don't mind. Anthony Wynne asked earlier on, and you very kindly gave a brief reply, can United Front agents communicate horizontally or only vertically? And then there's another very good question here from Matthew Gray, which I'd like to link to it. In this pendulum pursuit of enemies to friends, are the strict metrics they use to measure success and friendships? So I think it's interesting because you've talked about how multifaceted United Front is. And Steve's talked about this it's an approach, which isn't Western, obviously, it's a very Chinese concept. It's an approach to turn enemies to friends and neutralize opposition. From where you sit in Australia, obviously there's been a great deal more debate about this in the past few years, a great deal more written about it. How do you see that happening? How do you see this pursuit and the vertical and horizontal, multifaceted aspects of this from an Australian perspective?
No, there is plenty of horizontal United Front work, because it's often about influencing peers, not just going downwards, right? So it's often about going sideways and upwards. So that's really important to realize. So you can use anything, like use status to influence people or to win them over, to impress them. That's often a good one. And a key one is Chinese hospitality is wonderful for getting people's defenses down. After you've been to a couple of fantastic Chinese banquets, it's hard to resist being told that Gerry, you really understand China. I think you're a friend of China, and because that, Gerry, I think I can tell you this. And to be completely taken in, right? That's what I mean by these, building up these debts of obligation and so forth can be really powerful. Personal loyalty and everything can be really important in getting to know what's going on. But sometimes, because partly United Front work comes from the United Front Work Department and it's a bureaucracy, sometimes there are ridiculous metrics. So, they might say, how many people attended this event, or, how many copies of this did you sell? Sometimes it ends up, it can become that banal in a day-to-day level. But at the broader level, it gets back to the way Steve was just explaining. The idea is you win them over until you eliminate one enemy, and then you can move on to the lesser one, unless a bigger one is turned up in the meantime. And it's a very useful approach. And at the moment, we can see it happening in real time, with Xi Jinping being very clear about his support for Putin, and that America is the enemy. It's totally unambiguous, right? America is the enemy, and we know that because they're putting biolabs in the Ukraine, and they're responsible for COVID, and they're responsible for everything that's happened in the Ukraine. And the it's the poor Russians. What can they do? But so it's because the principal contradiction is liberal democracy, and it's making the world unsafe for China. So China can't expand if America is in the way. So we have to delegitimize China. China has to delegitimize America, and by default, Australia. So that's one of the way it works. But yeah, it can work. In broader terms, it's about. You might think that some of these ridiculous conspiracy theories, for example, are just propaganda, but they are also part of United Front work if they win people who believe in those things away from supporting America or towards supporting Russia. Then it becomes part of a broader picture. So there's no surprise why that sort of propaganda and United Front work and all these things, they're often interlinked in different ways, depending on the circumstance. So that's important to know.
Gerry, I think you've brought it right up to the geopolitical perspective as well, which is important. Perhaps we can go back across to the US and June for a little bit of perspective there. Perhaps specifically, June, if you wouldn't mind, from a US perspective, there's a very good question from Duncan asking about Confucius Institutes. It's a little bit specific and narrow, but I wonder if you could say something from a US perspective about this aspect of how United Front activities touch people. And there's growing concern, especially amongst many commentators and in the media, about Confucius Institutes. How effective are they? how much of a threat are they? And should we be more concerned about other areas and not Confucius Institutes?
I definitely think that Confucius Institutes are a concern at the moment. And there have been a number of incidents, actually the most egregious one in Canada, when a Confucius Institute teacher was, she quote, came out as a member of Falun Gong, and the Confucius Institute ordered that she be fired. And that was McMaster University. And McMaster said no. And the Confucius Institutes began to get a much worse name than they already had. And in the United States, two senators in particular, Ted Cruz of Texas and Marco Rubio of Florida, have lobbied pretty successfully for closing Confucius Institutes. They have, the universities say, but we can't afford to teach Chinese. And what Rubio and Cruz did is get money allocated so that US government money, so that the universities can teach Chinese language if they close their Confucius Institutes. And that's been very successful. But however, and this goes to what Steve was saying, you know, you can adapt. They have, Confucius Institutes have closed, but they have changed their names. And it's now the Chinese Society for Development or something, language development. So they still exist. And how, I'm not clear on the connection between the university, because one of the problems with the Confucius Institutes was that they were, unlike, for example, the British Council or Alliance Française, they were not housed outside the university, but within the university. And in fact, Confucius classrooms taught little kids things about the Sino-Japanese War that I'm talking about the 1894-95 one, that simply weren't true. And so whether this is going to be continued in this other form, I can't say because it's too new. And you know, it would seem to me that what's happening is that China is having tactical successes, but strategic failures with its united front, in the sense that they can succeed in getting airlines and stores to cease mentioning Taiwan, unless they call it a province of China, or hurting advertising. And if they don't take the Chinese position in the South China Sea and things like that. But it's a strategic failure in that these tactics have caused a backlash, which is growing. I notice, and others can perhaps tell me their perspective on this from the UK and Australia, but I don't see many wolf warrior tactics in the last couple of months. Could they have pivoted on that?
June, thank you very much.
That's a good point.
Why don't we cut back to Steve, because we're a little bit over time. I think Michael's being kind to us and we still have quite a lot of people on, so we can keep going. Steve, would you like to say something about that? You know, as I think all of you have said, United Front strategy under this more adversarial foreign policy approach from the PRC clearly hasn't worked. It's alienated more people than it's co-opted. So is it going to change, do you think? Steve, what's the outlook, do you think, going forward in the near term?
Well, I think the issue here really is that the United Front might have been talked about as a magic weapon and is still being seen as a magic weapon by Xi Jinping. But he's not very good in actually sticking to it. He's not very disciplined, in spite of him insisting that first and foremost, everything about the Communist Party is to be very strongly disciplined. So he unleashed the wolf warriors. I think it's easy for us to dismiss that and simply say that the wolf warriors came out and Xi Jinping just sort of allowed them to happen. It doesn't happen in the Chinese system under Xi Jinping. You cannot go unpunished. if you have done something which is disapproved of by Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping clearly approves of the wolf warriors for the simple reason, for the simple reality that no wolf warrior diplomat has ever been punished for speaking out of turns and provoking negative responses globally to their actions, and therefore damaging China's international image, and indeed undermining what the United Front is supposed to do and deliver for China. So we have that problem here, and which kind of makes it difficult for the United Front to work effectively as it is intended in theory as the magic weapon. I think that is the kind of saving grace. And I think June provided a very good example of how the Chinese government tried to resolve that problem of the Confucius Institutes simply by changing the label. Instead of having a sub-government department, Hanban, to be the body responsible for the Confucius Institutes, now they establish what they would call an NGO to be the parent institution for the Confucius Institute. So what do all these foreigners who have their bellies full and nothing better to do than to just criticize China on something that is groundless? Now, the reality is, it doesn't matter whether Confucius Institutes are formally responsible to an NGO or to a sub-department in the Chinese government, because above that NGO or the government department, Hanban, is the propaganda department of the Communist Party, which is responsible for superintending all their work anyway. So it is the party institution that really actually matters, and that hasn't changed. So the way how they work are unlikely to change. And if we do pay more attention to the specifics of how the Chinese operates, then we will be able to see through what they actually are doing. Then the United Front is not as worrying as the magic weapon conceptualization would make it out to be. But if we are not well informed about how the Chinese system actually operates, then the magic weapon will be much more effective. And that's, I think, what we have to bear in mind.
Thank you very much, Steve. Michael's given us a couple more minutes. We still have quite a few people on, and I think it would be worthwhile, in light of what Steve's just said about understanding United Front as a magic weapon, and hence how successful it can then be, going back to Australia and Gerry, because it does strike me that because of the debate about the influence of agents of the PRC government in Australia for the past few years, and people like Gerry and others writing about that, there's probably an earlier stage of more public awareness of United Front and its impact on your own political system, your own government, etc. So Gerry, how do you see in Australia that's developed now? Do you think that's turned more people against Chinese influence? Has United Front been less successful in that regard?
Australia has passed a number of laws to try to force people to divulge if they are working on behalf of foreign governments. The Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, you have to register if you're a lobbyist, etc., those sorts of things. What's happened with lots of United Front groups is that they simply stopped going public. And some of them were immediately rendered useless. And a couple of individuals were also rendered useless. So, and one was notoriously prevented from re-entering Australia because he had let some of his paperwork lapse, and when he reapplied for his visa, they simply didn't let him in. And he has since re-established himself in Hong Kong, where he's now on the committee selecting the new what's his name, the chief executive. So that's not, so, you know, he's just the ordinary billionaire doing ordinary billionaire things, like being involved in the the Association for the Peaceful Unification of China, and you know, choosing chief executive officers for Hong Kong, like, you know, your average billionaire. Yep. Anyway, not every, so but in Australia, it can actually be quite difficult, because we, like Britain, have quite strong libel laws, which the powerful can use quite readily, and do. So although a lot has been discussed, a lot isn't. So, but it's made many groups a lot more hesitant about coming out. But I mentioned in one of my responses to one of the questions on the Q&A that Steve's point was a very important one. So sometimes, if people come out in support of these United Front positions or Chinese positions, and then they get criticized, then sometimes that works to the Communist Party's advantage, because they say, see, only China defends you. They don't see that as a normal part of a democratic process. They just, you know, that becomes a confirmation bias. That's part of, you know, the system's against you, and, you know, it's racism and so forth. So, and there's been an instance of that in the election happening here in Australia at the moment. We have a federal election coming up, and some of that is happening at this moment, actually. So the United Front organisation connections of one or two of the candidates has been dragged up in the press, and other people are being very upset that this is racism and it's unfair, etc. So and that, I have to say, that is a very fine line, and it's difficult sometimes to know how to be fair, because of course you can try to be fair as a journalist and be as objective as possible, but that doesn't mean that the readers necessarily read it the same way. So that's a problem. But in some, United Front work has been publicly quite attenuated since the passing of these laws, and the high level of scrutiny that it's encountered. And my last writing on this, I was pleased to say that I didn't find any lawsuits in my mail, so I'm quite happy about that.
Not yet, Gerry.
Not yet.
But please keep writing. We do. I think that's the one thing from all three of you. If I could just close out and hand back to Michael. You've written about this subject already, and I think it's increasingly important that people like you write more and say more, because your insight is definitely needed, especially in all three of the countries in which we now sit, and others where United Front isn't well understood. I think there was a lot more to talk about today that we could come on to by reading your papers, obviously. But for example, United Front is an espionage tool, which it certainly has been. And I recall from when I was in Special Branch in Hong Kong in the early 1990s, United Front activities were mostly from the New China News Agency. And that was a front for most of their espionage activities. And then we also didn't come on to business much, and how business co-opts, how United Front agencies and agents co-opt business. I think Gerry mentioned it very briefly, but very, very succinctly, with those wonderful dinners you can be treated to, and dangerous amounts of mautai, which can have a purpose if one isn't careful. And the flattery can be quite deceiving. So I think dealing with certain people in certain companies and government agencies, and that hospitality and flattery needs a great deal of level-headedness to make sure it doesn't have another purpose. But much more to say, and I hope we'll see more from all three of you in written form sometime soon. Michael, sorry for overrunning, but we still have a bit of an audience. If I could hand back to you, please.
Thank you very much indeed for that hugely informative discussion. I'm sure we will have many reasons to return to this subject over the next few years. I was much taken with Gerry's reference to the involvement of ordinary billionaires, and the RSAA is not a wealthy organization. So, if any happen to be listening, please feel free to get in touch. I'm grateful to all of our speakers, but I would particularly like to thank June and Gerry, as they have been operating at the extremes of their own time zones from Miami and Adelaide. A recording of today's discussion will be available on the RSAA website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And for those that would like a transcript of this event, it will similarly be available through the RSAA website. Next week, we return to the series that we have been running with Aleph Strategies since December on culture, conflict and recovery in Asia. And on the 4th of May, we will have a discussion led by Ashley Jackson from ODI, previously known as the Overseas Development Institute, with independent consultant Jolyon Leslie and Mehmet Balki, founder of the human rights organization Fight for Humanity. And they will be addressing the challenge of cultural engagement with armed groups. I hope you will be able to join us. Until then, thank you to our audience for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Martin for putting this event together, and goodbye.